I'm Annika Small. I'm the co-founder of CAST, which is an organization that works with charities and social enterprises, trusts and foundations, big technology and government to accelerate the use of digital technology to drive social change. What I love about digital technology is that it challenges our assumptions and it encourages us to imagine a different world. Imagine the UK as the leader in bringing a social purpose to the digital revolution. After all, the digital revolution isn't about apps and websites. It's about shifting power from established institutions to individuals and their communities who now have the digital tools to create, to share, to organize. It's about collaboration, not doing things to people or for them, but with them. The digital revolution is the opportunity to place the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged at the very heart of co-designing new social and civic services. Let me just give you 3 quick examples. Take Wayfinder, which is revolutionizing travel for the blind and visually impaired. Using turn-by-turn audio navigation services delivered on a smartphone, navigating, whether it's an airport, a shopping center, a tube station, is just made so much more easier. What's also really powerful about that particular example is that the visually impaired can create and share their own routes, thereby creating a dynamic crowdsourced tool. Another example is Helpforce, where volunteers who have cars and some time on their hands are being connected with people in their community who need help with a lift to a doctor's appointment or a hospital appointment, creating something along the lines of a free Uber for community transport. And take breast cancer care, which has had intensive engagement with women with cancer and has found that there is a massive need for emotional support after their treatment has ended. When they've been given the all clear, friends, family think the ordeal is over, but actually many women are left feeling adrift and profoundly isolated. Breast Cancer Care's app helps to get them just the support they need at that time and has already helped more than 12,000 users, women, in just under a year. Just like to touch on 3 really important points on all of those examples. Firstly, all of them use fairly basic technology. The innovation isn't around a flashy new bit of kit. Instead, it is about using and reusing existing tools that can be used to fundamentally rethink how a service is delivered. Secondly, these organizations were seriously bold. They relinquished some of their power and shifted agency to their users, who then became absolutely core to the development of the new services. And thirdly, these initiatives were able to scale quickly because they had established infrastructure, they had extensive reach, and they had, importantly, trusted relationships with their service users. So where social tech startup ventures typically take somewhere in the region of 5 to 7 years to reach scale, these initiatives, and we're finding it a lot with CAST in our work with established charities, could scale in less than half that time. Pretty powerful stuff, and really shows how digital technology can help civil society to become much more responsive and resilient. And yet, the very recent Charity Digital Report made pretty sobering reading. More than 2/3 of charities in the UK can see the potential for digital to transform their services, but don't have a plan, don't have a clue how they're going to do that. They need guidance and they need funding. But currently we have something of a spaghetti of support organizations, making it really difficult for charities to find that right support at the right time. And trusts and foundations have been pretty slow to support digital transformation. Many see it as a core cost, and very few are willing to fund that. If we don't urgently support social organizations to embed digital in their strategy, in their services, in their culture, we can very quickly imagine a very different future. one where charities who are absolutely at the front line in the fight against inequality, whether that's in health or housing or employment or income, and who act as a lifeline for millions of people in desperate need, will go to the wall, having failed to make use of digital tools and techniques to become more nimble, more sustainable, more democratic. In Stephen Fry's analogy, the internet is like a city, a new city under almost constant construction. So far, we have been building these cities mostly without the contribution from the people who live and breathe equality, ethics, and fairness. Cities built almost entirely without that zeal, without the ideals of our modern-day equivalents of Florence Nightingale and William Beveridge and William Wilberforce. Are these really the cities that we want to live in, where those least advantaged are least well served? I don't think so, and I really hope we're not going to sleepwalk into that sort of future. Instead, we need to actively take advantage of digital as the most powerful democratic tool for social change that we have ever had. That's going to take imagination and bold thinking. It's going to take widened participation, importantly, much more diverse and more inclusive voices in the creation of new tools and solutions. And it's going to take committed cross-sector action. This is a critical time. It's a critical time, and it's time for all of us to join forces across social, across business, across government, across tech, and absolutely instill a social purpose in the digital revolution. Now, I am thrilled to be able to introduce 3 organizations who are doing just that.
The first thing I would say is domestic abuse affects all of us, and we talk a lot at Safe Lives about there being no them and us, so I think it's really important always to start any of these conversations off by saying we know that many of the people in this room will have had their own experiences with domestic abuse. Any of us can be affected. Any of us here may have had an experience. We may even still be having an experience. And we always speak in that spirit, which is there is no them out there experiencing domestic abuse. It's us. It's all of us. We are all touched by it in some way. And that might be very directly or it might be indirectly. But whoever we are, whatever kind of front door we live behind, it doesn't exclude us from the experience of domestic abuse. And we always like to put that on the table first. Really, really briefly, Safe Lives started as an organization 15 years ago that was primarily concerned with the survivor, the adult survivor. And obviously there we've got a picture of a woman. As I've just said, this can affect everybody. We know it disproportionately affects women, but it's certainly by no means only women. And that's where we began, was thinking that what we really wanted was for people to be able to stay in their own homes, that this idea of you having to kind of flee in the middle of the night with the bin bags in one hand and your kids under the other arm was very, very outdated, and we set about creating other options so that that didn't have to be the only option if you wanted to exit a domestic abuse situation. And so was born the concept of the Independent Domestic Violence Advisor, of which there are now around 800 around the country. And we're also very keen that they should always take into account all agencies' responsibilities. So as much as all of us in this room could be affected, everyone that we are, every place that we work also has a role in ending domestic abuse, and we've always felt that very strongly. More recently, as an organization, we've been thinking about the whole picture. And over the last few years, we've been thinking not just about that adult survivor who will always remain absolutely central to what we do, but also everybody else who's represented on this very complicated, spidery-looking diagram here. This is representative of a case study that we were asked to look at a number of years ago now, where 2 guys, Jamie and Scott, died in the same house on the same day, and the local authority was sufficiently concerned about that to ask us to find out what the connection between them might have been. And what we found, without going into all of the detail, though I'm very happy to do that later, is when we pulled the thread was their lives were extremely complex. They touched many, many, many family members, all of whom had been touched by the fact that Jamie and Scott were deeply abusive individuals. They'd been in the army together, which was where they first met. They went on to be deeply abusive in multiple relationships with their partners, with their children, and indeed with their parents. So what's important to us at Safe Lives increasingly is that we think of domestic abuse in that whole picture perspective, and that's why we talk about it affecting everybody, because it really does. So in terms of tech the abuse, as Annika was just touching on, we are really strong believers at Safe Lives that tech and digital in particular can be the most incredible force for really radical democracy. This is not my phrase, but I cannot remember where I found it. So if any of you were the originator of that phrase, I'm sorry I've nicked it. But I do credit you. Wherever I go, I do at least say it's some anonymous source. It wasn't me that came up with that. And what it means in terms of radical democracy is, as Annika was talking about, that we now want to make sure that this isn't just about charities telling people either how to live their lives or how to make themselves safe or how things can be better, but really creating platforms where people can do that for themselves, relinquishing our power, relinquishing our central role, getting ourselves out of the way as much as we possibly can, and leaving that space open for other people to have a conversation. So the Safe Lives community, which is what you can see up there, is something that we developed after I went on the digital fellowship with CAST. Annika says there's this sort of spaghetti of organizations out there, and who can you get help from? Well, CAST have been the most unbelievable support to us as an organization. And if you're a charity worker in this room, I would definitely recommend that you get in touch with CAST to see what your organization could do with them. Safe Lives community was just an idea that we had about making sure that people all around the UK could be in touch with each other to talk about domestic abuse responses. So this is a practitioner-focused idea. Often, unfortunately, in the charity sector, as people will know, there can be competition that's come locally through commissioning processes. People feel like they've got to hide things from their neighbouring charities because they're going through commissioning processes, deeply unhealthy, kind of changing the nature of kind of collaborative working at local level. So what we wanted the community to do was to get away from that idea that your neighbour is your competition or that your fellow practitioner is your competition, and put people in touch with each other and with us in a much more fluid, flexible, completely free way, so that, you know, if you are sitting there at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday trying to write a bid, that there might somebody else somewhere in the UK might also be online, also trying to grapple with the same experience, and put those people in touch with each other. And of course they can be in touch with us at Safe Lives, but actually it doesn't need to be us. It can be that peer network, that peer support. And as I say, it's completely free. I will come back in a second to how we develop that. And then the bottom right-hand side represents a thing called Every Story Matters. So as much as I'm deeply passionate about putting these digital tools in the hands of my own organization and the practitioners that we support, what obviously gets me out of bed in the morning is the idea of making everyone's lives better if they're having an experience of domestic abuse or if they've had an experience of domestic abuse. And Every Story Matters was our way of saying everybody should have a chance to participate in the government's recent consultation around new legislation. So the government, bless them, had written their usual 112-page PDF. And, you know, they tried. They then slimmed it down to a 57-page PDF, which was supposed to help people kind of engage with the process. Most people won't. I, wouldn't if I was, a member of the public and this wasn't my job. So we wanted to create something that really spoke to people about their own experiences and ask them questions in a way that would make them feel that they could tell their story, hence Every Story Matters. So it was done as a kind of picture book almost, and you could just write in a little bit, or you could upload some audio, or you could do some video. And it was only started a couple of weeks before the end of the consultation, but over 400 people got in touch and took part in that process. And many of those people have said they want to stay in touch both with us and with each other. Now, historically, if you wanted to kind of reach out and take part in some kind of domestic abuse peer network or whatever, it might entail you going and sitting in a kind of slightly grey or maybe even sunny room on a kind of wet Tuesday with a soggy biscuit in front of you. That is not the world that we currently live in. We've gone beyond that. People can't get there at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday for loads and loads of different reasons, or they don't feel like they fit in that group situation. This gives everybody the opportunity to take part and to take back the control of what's going on for them, which is so important. If you live with domestic abuse, you know what you need is to be put in control of your own situation rather than always having it kind of ceded to somebody else. So radical democracy, the charity getting out of the way, allowing people to become what one of our pioneers, our experts by experience, calls the army coming over the hill. Because we know 2 million people had a domestic abuse experience in England and Wales alone just last year, 2 million people. We're a charity of 70 people, so kind of moderate-sized charity, but that's 2 million people who can begin to change the world. And so if we can create those platforms for them to do that, whether or not we're involved, that's got to be a good thing. And I will just skip straight on. to say if you want to be in touch after the event, we'd really love to hear from you. That is it in really brief form.
Thank you. As Annika just said, in 2016, I founded the Prototype Fund. That's a funding program that supports the development of digital tools, tools that help to protect privacy, increase data literacy, and more generally focuses on technology for the common good. Over the course of 4 years, we're going to hand out 8 million euros in Germany to 200 projects, to individuals and small groups. The money comes from the Federal Ministry of Education and Science. So it's tax money, basically, that supports the development of sustainable tools. We started the program because we saw that there was a lack of responsible tech, that there was a lack of alternatives to like big corporates, and tech that fits the needs of citizens and of civil society organizations. The title of our second call, we have 8 calls in total, was Tools for a Stronger Civil Society. We decided for this focus after the US election and the Brexit, because we wanted to encourage people to build tools that enable activists to organize and mobilize their supporters and to collect information and share knowledge. So we saw organizations that struggled with things like finding a privacy-protecting good tool in order to register participants for an event, for example. Sounds like a small issue, but this is what a lot of organizations do, host events. Another tool that we developed, or another challenge that we saw, was organizations having tons of documents that they have to structure, analyze, and organize, like, for example, a human rights organization. Or on the more like common side of things, tools that are easy to use and that are for secure communications. So we were able to support projects like Co-Budget. That's a tool that helps organizations to allocate funds collaboratively and transparently, and also groups that develop platforms that help people to organize on a local level, privacy-protecting platforms and platforms that respect the data of the users. We don't adapt to technology, we shape technology. And why should civil society organizations adapt to technology? Why not the other way around? Why not build tools that actually fit their needs? Digital tools that respect privacy, as I mentioned, and help to increase transparency. Tools that are not spying on you and your users and are not selling your data, but are the opposite. Open source instead of closed systems that might turn bad on you. Civil society organizations should push for these ethical tools, for these ethical digital tools that reflect their values and beliefs. There are a lot of groups and individuals and also companies out there who share the same values and who are interested in building civic tech for the good. We received close to 300 submissions for this first round from individuals. But in order to really leverage this engagement and motivation, you have to bring together both stakeholders, the tech experts on one side and the nonprofits on the other side, who have a lot of know-how and expertise on certain topics. For civil society organizations, it's important to learn about the opportunities, but also be aware of the risks, and to invest into capacity building, because otherwise you're always dependent on others and you're not as agile. And for companies and tech communities, it's really crucial to figure out what are the needs of these organizations, the users. What are their threat models? What are the threat models of their communities? Why do they need different tools? This is important to build sustainable tech, to follow on the needs and not follow on the technology. So the approach that I'm suggesting is for sure neither an easy nor a straightforward endeavor. But if we strive for sustainable and responsible solutions that reflect our values, this might be a good building block. In order to succeed, we need support. We need support by funders who understand the technical challenges and the infrastructure that organizations need. And we have to form strong networks, not only among organizations, but also between organizations and, let's say, civic tech communities or companies who stand for the same values. This is, of course, not the only way to go. Things are not as black and white, like in the title, as they're often portrayed when we talk about technology. There's many shades of gray in between adapting and dying. But it's not too late to help and shape the debate and to open up for change. Thank you. I work for the Mobilization Lab, which is a global network and innovation hub of about 5,000 activists, campaigners, innovators, technologists around the world. And what we do is we work with civil society organizations specifically and the people who work within those organizations to help them accelerate change by adapting to an era that is people-powered, that is digital, and that is networked. So what I'm going to talk about a bit today is the things that we see that civil society organizations need to do in order to be effective in today's world and to actually meet the challenges that we're facing. So what's different about today? Well, hopefully you all know this. New digital technology opens up the opportunity for more people to have power in their hands to make change happen and to lead change. How we see this happening, things like the Women's March was started by a Facebook post by a woman in Hawaii. That resulted in 7 million people around the world marching on the streets. And it didn't stop there, though. It ended with the Me Too movement, well not ended, continued with the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, institutions being set up around the world, and it's really shifted the narrative on misogyny, on sexual assault, on gender equality in many places around the world in ways that established organizations have been trying to do for decades but haven't been able to. And so there's a lot for us as civil society organizations to learn from these new movements and from these new ways of working and employing digital technology in order to actually respond to the challenges that we're facing today. In practice, what this means is we're moving from a model of sort of institution or organization-led change to a model where people are leading change. This is what Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Timms, who I think are speaking tomorrow about their book New Power, call old power, which is kind of hierarchical, top-down, and controlled. And this needs to meet and be merged with new power, which is networked, dispersed, and actually people-powered. And specifically, what we do at MobLab is we look at what can organizations do in order to get to this point. And we have 4 principles that we work through with organizations. And we say, you know, digital technology is a tool and it has to be used, but underlying that, there need to be certain principles by which organizations are operating. And the first one is organizations need to have a beating heart. That means they need to use the power of storytelling to engage people's hearts, their minds, to change what's happening in society. And you see things like the March for Our Lives, the student protesters, survivors, who are leading this change and shifting the gun control narrative in the US in ways, again, that established organizations have failed to do for decades and decades. And established organizations need to support these movements by stepping back and allowing these people, or letting these people and supporting them to tell their stories, supporting them with resources, but not taking center stage. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of established charities and NGOs, to actually let other people speak and to let the people speak who are most impacted by the issues that they're speaking on. The second thing is that we need many hands and we need real work. Staff in civil society organizations are not going to be able to make the change happen that we need on their own. We need as many people involved as possible doing real meaningful work. So not just signing petitions that go nowhere or giving money that they don't know what happens with it, but actually getting engaged in real meaningful ways in the work that they're doing. There's a great example in the UK. There were a bunch of activists who wanted to show some solidarity with people around the world who are going to be impacted by Trump's presidency. And so they decided to organize an action. And this landed up being 250 banner drops across 5 continents, volunteer-led, volunteer-organized, and volunteer-implemented. And the amazing organizations that did then offer some support did it without their logo. They didn't put their brand on it. They gave resources, they gave space, they trained people in how to do banner drops, they helped with media, but they didn't take center stage. And this is really a core thing for the future of civil society organizations, is the role is to actually enable and empower activists and people to make change happen instead of trying to hold on to that yourselves and using the new tools that we have, the new digital tools, to actually do that in a more accelerated way. And the last point is having fast feet. What we mean by this is civil society organizations come with a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of resources, but they also come with a lot of bureaucracy, processes where you spend a year doing a strategy for a campaign that's going to last 3 years, and by the time you get to start it, the moment's passed, but you have to do the campaign anyway because you've just spent a year planning it. And so you run with a campaign for 3 years that has absolutely no impact. This obviously is not working. And so what organizations really need to do is to learn to get rid of as much bureaucracy as possible, to empower their staff to take risks, to experiment, to do things that don't work and to try again, to use data as much as possible, gather as much data as you possibly can, understand your audience, understand the people you are working with, and use that to fuel your campaigns instead of sitting in a room with 3 people deciding what's the best way forward. So the final thing, and we have these 4 principles, and then the thing that underpins all these principles, and which is really important today, is that organizations actually start to take seriously the issue of equity and inclusion within our organizations. Something that I often get asked is people come and they're like, Jacqui, how do we make my membership more diverse? And I'm sitting in front of a room of 20 white, middle to upper middle class people, and they're like, we just want to engage people of color and disabled people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer is, well, change your organization first. Look at your organizational culture. Is it actually open and welcome to a diverse set of people? Who's leading? Who's got power in your organization? Who speaks? Who's listened to? And start to shift those things, because once you actually shift those things and take equity and inclusion seriously, you'll be able to engage a diverse and wide audience of people. You know, organizations often say that they want to change their strategies, their tactics, their tools. And what we found with the organizations we work with around the world is that the ones that actually do it effectively and the ones that manage to change are ones that have 2 things. And the one is a leadership that is willing to embrace these 4 principles and equity and inclusion and take that seriously. And the second thing is they have a critical mass of internal change agents who fearlessly challenge the status quo and ask, is what my organization is doing, who's doing it, and how are we doing it the most effective way that we can make change happen today? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Jacqui, and to all the panelists for such practical and inspiring insights. I'd like to invite you all onto the stage, and I'm going to do my best, Jeremy Kyle, and take some questions, hopefully, from the audience.
I'm Russell Hargrave. I'm a freelance reporter, and I've got 2 questions really quickly, if that's all right. One is, given there's been a trend here about large NGOs maybe stepping back, less interest in their branding and their communications, more in empowering communities, what is it does the panel think has stopped that happening so far? Because that idea has been around for a little while. And the second would be, what advice would you particularly have, Annika, for organizations who are worried that they are, as you put it, in danger of going to the wall and need help now?
In terms of the first one, why hasn't it happened yet? I guess I would say possibly 2 things, although you know others will speak for themselves. One is charities think they know best. I mean, you know, you join a charity because it has an ethos and a mission statement and some objectives and priorities, and you know you've spent a long time developing those. So, you know, if somebody comes along to challenge those, you know, we found through Every Story Matters, many of the people who responded said things that we don't say as an organization. And we're like, shit. So, what are we going to do about that? I mean, what you're going to do about that is you have to listen to what people are telling you, because you're supposed to be there as a kind of service to people. So if it doesn't agree with your, your historic key message, well, too bad. You're going to have to reflect on that. I think the other thing is money. So both of the panelists talked about how it's about kind of getting your brand out of the way and getting yourself out of the way. Well, that's scary for a charity, because then who's going to give you money? Because it's invisible that you did something which created change. So, where was your value that you were adding, and why would somebody fund you to do that? So that's a risk for people, I guess.
The second question was about why, organizations who are worried about that they're not keeping up with the pace. So the most frustrating thing for me, and when working, for example, with tech communities, is when they stay in their bubbles, when they develop a tool because they think it's like an interesting technology and it might solve a problem, but they don't know what it will actually solve, or they haven't identified what they actually want to build, and they are disconnected. We saw this during the refugee crisis that's still ongoing in Germany. In the beginning, tech communities were like, we know exactly what to do. You need this tool in order to kind of figure out where people can bring their stuff and have lists with the needs. But a lot of organizations and volunteers already had that. They had spreadsheets which worked perfectly fine for them. So I guess as an organization that's worried, go out, meet people, go to meetups, see who else is working on civic tech or who's volunteering in the space, and connect to those people. That's the first step.
Yeah, and I think there's, I think the money point is an important one, and I think the thing that's often stopping organizations is that they actually lack some moral courage. There was an example of an organization that was about to launch a massive campaign on supporting refugees, and the media narrative shifted almost overnight. This was around Christmas and New Year's in the UK, and instead of actually holding their moral stance and running the campaign, they cut the campaign and they didn't do anything because they were scared that they were going to lose some donations from people. And they probably would have, but they would have done the right thing, and they probably would have gained a whole chunk of new supporters. And the thing that charities, I think, that stops them is the fear, but the thing that they don't realize is that you kind of have to cut off old wood sometimes in order to let new things flourish. And so they just have to have the courage to do that. And I think in terms of support, there are a lot of organizations out there doing work to support charities to come into the digital age, but also there are an incredible amount of people who already work in these charities who have the knowledge and the skills, and they aren't allowed, because of the way these charities are run, to actually bring this into their work. And I think that's a thing which I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but organizations actually need to shift how they think about those things.
Thank you. Somewhat selfishly, I work for a funder in New Zealand, and I'm interested in what it looks like when funders are doing this well and enabling.
I guess from our perspective, it's a bit of patience, because we've stuttered at various things that we tried, and if we'd had a funder who was thinking in a very linear way about there being only one particular thing that would look like success, then they would have thought we'd failed. But if it's a funder who's willing to kind of go with you through that process, so what we've done as an organization is we now quite regularly have funders on our project boards, and that's a bit scary because it means you're airing a bunch of dirty linen in public, but it works. And I think for the funders who are willing to engage a bit more in the process and be a bit more human about the whole thing, I'm sure we could say this about everything to do with funding, that's deeply helpful.
Yeah, another so I used to work for a nonprofit for the last 6 years, and we were always looking for core funding. So what you get is project-related funding. You come up with a concept, and then you get money for this particular project. But then to train staff, to build capacities, you need flexibility, and you need core funding for your organization. So I would encourage funders to focus on the maybe not as sexy core funding.
Yeah, I think that's probably the main thing as well, is core funding, and supporting organizations to fail. If an organization needs to try and test stuff out for a couple of years, this pressure to have objectives, and then we're going to have this impact in 1 year's time, and then after that we're going to have that impact within. That's not how the real world works, and it puts organizations under huge constraints to try and follow a model that's actually not real. And so actually shifting how they fund. But I think the other thing that's really important for funders is the competition in the social change sector. There are a lot of organizations and there's very little funding. And so this, what I think you were talking about before, of like the lack of collaboration between organizations, also stems from funding, because we're all vying for a tiny pool of money that comes from the same place. So the idea of like, how do you support organizations to actually work together is an important one.
Just add a couple of points that are fantastic. That funders who focus on short-term solutions and don't help charities to iterate and actually solve the longer-term problem is a real issue. And also there is still a tendency to want to support the shiny new thing rather than actually, it's not as glamorous, but reusing existing tools in powerful new ways is really what charities need help to do. And I think that's such an important point about shared solutions. And funders need to recognise, or certainly not underestimate, their influence. That imagine if 10% of a grant is directed towards supporting charities to respond to digital, or if there was a premium put on reusing existing tools, or if actually you were only open to applications from a set of charities who'd actually defined a shared problem that they were setting out to solve. So thinking about ways that funders can really work alongside charities as engaged partners and break through, flip this power dynamic that continues to exist.
Thank you. It's really, really interesting. Is there a tension between build the tools that for yourselves that kind of maybe match your values and building your communities, compared to using some of the kind of dominant platforms through which things like Me Too or the Women's March are propagated? And if so, how do you resolve that tension?
There's a lot of great platforms out there that you can use, but I think before you use or decide for a tool, you should make sure to like figure out what are their privacy policies, what are your values, and does this company reflect your values? What are maybe hurdles? Like, is this model going to be, or is this tool going to be free forever? Can I export my data? Things like this. And like someone in another session mentioned that there's a very like little intolerance for friction, and that's why people a lot of times like pick the tools that are convenient, but then in the end, like friction sometimes gets you, because then like your data gets leaked or like other disasters happen. So friction is not necessarily a bad thing.
One of the things that we definitely learned through working with CAST was this getting away from this idea of build it and they will come. You know, you're a little charity, build it and they definitely won't come. Or like 5 people will come, but they're the 5 people you already talked to already. So for us, there was a massive benefit in thinking about going to where people already are and hanging out with them where they are, rather than as an organization nobody's ever heard of, because we don't really have much of a public brand, like trying to pull people towards us. Because then we're kind of, I do definitely take the point about friction, but then we're definitely, we don't have the capability to like pull the whole of society in that opposite direction to the way they actually want to go. They've got to follow that intention path, and we've got to be on it with them, I think.
I agree, but there's also like solutions that are already out there that you don't have to build, right? Like you could use Google Hangouts or Jitsi, or you can use a browser that respects your privacy, or one where it's not like transparent what they're doing with your data. You can use an email provider that makes it easy to encrypt emails or not. So you can start with the infrastructure bits that are already out there that people are using and support these companies.
I mean, I also think it depends what the purpose of the tool is, and I think that, you know, always start with that question of what you're trying to achieve, because I think that building your own tools and using them can be very effective. So, for instance, the digital tools that were built during the Bernie Sanders campaign to engage people and get them on board, which was then brought over and used here by Momentum in the last election, were incredibly effective and were purpose-built tools that were then open-sourced. But if you're looking at things like mass engagement, things like Facebook, it is really difficult to get away from that, because still most people do use those platforms, or WhatsApp is really commonly used, especially in African countries and in India, as a tool for organizing. And it is to get to a point where we have an alternative to that is very difficult. And so I think one of the questions that we need to look at is actually the ownership of technology and AI, and I hope that's a conversation that's going to be happening in other spaces during FutureFest, but it's really important is who owns these platforms, and can we start to build things that can replace the ones that exist or shift the ownership models that we currently have within digital technology.
I just wanted to ask, so as charities, I work for a disability organisation, Leonard Cheshire, and often beneficiaries of charities by nature are kind of some of the furthest groups away from the development of technology. I wonder what the panel's thoughts were on how we can be really great at including those people within the development itself, so whether that's gender, race, ability, and make sure that they're kind of a key part of the development process.
I guess one of the things I would say is that for any kind of frontline service, and the same as tier 2, you're going to struggle to have all of the kind of knowledge and understanding that you need in a single organization. I absolutely agree about the point about kind of making sure that your organization starts to reflect a bit more who, the kind of whole community that you're trying to serve and being more representative. But if you know that you can't possibly kind of contain all of that inside your organization, then finding the people with whom, you can collaborate. So a lot of the work that we've done over the last couple of years has been with organizations like Deaf Hope have been really fantastic in just checking if we're creating something which just immediately begins to exclude somebody right from the outset. And we, it's not that we can necessarily build all of that skill and understanding and knowledge into our organization, but we certainly can by joining up with other people. And I guess then what comes with that is making sure that you fairly compensate those people, because often those are quite small, very specialist charities, and people might go to them for expertise and kind of lean on them a bit for that expertise without ever kind of compensating them for that, which I think is a different power dynamic in the charity sector, actually.
So I think one of the things that we do in a lot of our trainings and work with NGOs is bringing the practice of design thinking into how NGOs work. And one of the things we talk about there is actually the benefit of prototyping, so building many, many different prototypes and actually going out and speaking to people, to real people outside of your organizations, and seeing what it is that they need, what it is that they respond to, what it is that they will use, and actually just doing that, and based on that information, then taking the next step and iterating again and going back to people and speaking with them again. And I think that alongside the collaboration and the reaching out is a good way to start.
Yeah, and if you're working in the field of accessibility, you don't want to start with building your own tools, but like lobbying for more accessible tech, like pointing out like where are the pitfalls, what has to be changed. So your strength could be campaigning. I don't know what your team looks like, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like a tech product.
Just to pick up on your point, that I think there is a bit of a movement now to embed those user-centered processes. There is a risk, though, I'm seeing it time and again, that charities perhaps focus on that aspect in their initial research and co-design, but don't necessarily keep the users engaged throughout the process. So I think that's absolutely vital. I think we've got time for one more. One more.
Thank you. My question is, to what extent do you think is rigid leadership in charities and outdated perceptions of what works and what doesn't the thing that's stopping charities becoming more digitalized?
I'd say definitely massive, and I think both boards and leadership, there's a lot of space for making those more diverse, but also bringing in younger people. There's often a perception that young people can't be in positions of leadership or can't make decisions around things, even if they don't have formal leadership, they have kind of the legitimacy and the power to make decisions about the things that they know about. And there is often quite a lot of resistance to that. And I think the NGO sector really needs to open itself up to the idea that, young people who have grown up with digital technology actually have a lot of these solutions and should be able to bring those in with a lot of power and a lot of kind of legitimacy to actually just make them happen rather than just talk about them or use them as tools. So yes, I think leadership structures and the models of leadership that we have, where we have a CEO who just kind of determines everything, as opposed to empowered workers who can actually make decisions about their own work, where they have the best information, do need to shift. And there are organizations who are shifting it, who you see really having a big impact.
I think it's also about confidence. I think sometimes what looks like resistance is actually a lack of confidence. So that doesn't have to be just at senior executive level. That could be at all levels in the organization. You know, what we found when I came back, all sort of gung-ho and evangelist from the Digital Fellowship, you know, there were various members of the team in various bits of the organization like, okay, well, you can do that over there, but I'm definitely not getting involved in that. And that wasn't because they didn't want to change. You know, we are an organization that's constantly looking at how we can improve doing things. And that's why, you know, I kind of love the organization so much. But when people aren't confident, they often are seen to dig their heels, and it looks like resistance, but it's actually, they need a lot more reassurance about how is that going to work, and are we going to lose something by adopting these new things that you're talking about? And I guess, again, there's a kind of question of patience, I think, with that. If you're the person who's very energetic and enthusiastic about it, not forgetting that maybe you've got to bring people with you, not by force, but by showing rather than telling that things are going to be okay and things can be better, and you're not going to lose what's really brilliant about what the organization already does. Because I guess the flip side of the resistant kind of board or chief exec is the one who's super gung-ho and is not either taking the organization with them or is jumping for the big shiny that Annika was talking about. Like, let's have an app, let's have a this, let's have a that. And actually, if they would listen to the team, or if they would hear really from the team or from, you know, kind of colleague organizations, they'd understand that small and incremental might be much less glamorous and sexy, but actually do something much more impactful. So
yeah, and if you end up having like a leadership as you just described it, then you will be an unattractive employer, and like the best people won't come to you and join your organization. So then you might actually die at some point.
Not the note that I'd hoped that we finish on. Thank you to the panelists, to Jacqui, to Julia, to Suzanne, and thank you all for your wonderful questions and your time. Thank you.
Thank you.